right, page 43. We're going to be talking a little bit more about constitutional law now. I meant to talk about this 2 class sessions ago and I forgot. So, we're going to go through this fairly quickly because it's fairly straightforward. But this is a possible fill-in-the-blank question. All right, exclusive federal regulatory power. So going back to the beginning, sources of law, federal versus state. Like we talked about earlier, we are a federal system. We have 50 state governments that fall under the umbrella of one federal system, the United States of America, our federal government. So through the U.S. Constitution, the states, which otherwise could be sovereign countries of their own, theoretically speaking, have agreed to give up some of the powers that a sovereign country otherwise would have and transfer those powers to the federal government exclusively. In other words, in plain English, only the federal government can engage in lawmaking in this area, in these areas, unless they agree to transfer that power to the state. So states cannot engage in these areas. That's basically what I'm getting at. So pretty straightforward. Number one, only the federal government can have official currency, money, the United States dollar. So individual states cannot have their own currency. Why? Why not have, Oregon have its currency and Idaho and California? And why? Is that very efficient? You have to have exchange rates, right? So what would we call the Oregon currency? How about the Oro, right? Oregon, gold, the euro, not the Oro, right? The Oro. We have cryptocurrency for Oregon, the Oro. Now, that's why the US dollar. The reason why is it's efficient. You don't want to have exchange rates from one state to the next. You don't want to have states having their own currency and then either engaging in printing, and having hyperinflation and all that kind of stuff. So it's not effective. That's why they're going to the euro, of course, the European Union, for the same reason. All right. Number 2, which also ties into number 6. Regulate commerce with foreign countries, that is international business. And that goes along with number 6, the authority to impose tax on an imported good, that is tariff. So, exclusive federal power to engage in international business lawmaking. Tariffs, border crossings, bringing goods in, importing and exporting laws, tariffs that are placed on goods being bought in, import standards, engineering standards, customs procedures, all that. That's all federal law. The reason why, you want states, first of all, engaging in treaty making on their own with different countries. That needs to be done at the higher level. 2, you don't want states having different tariffs to import goods into their different states because it would set up a trade war between the states. It's not efficient. So we have the same law that applies to importation of goods, with some exceptions like in California or Hawaii where you've got prohibitions on fruits and vegetables. The federal government allows that. It's done with their agreement. Okay, number 3, bankruptcy. Bankruptcy is when you cannot afford to pay your debt, and you can apply to the court, the bankruptcy court, to either have your debt totally wiped out or to be basically put on a payment plan. That's exclusively federal. The reason for that is you don't want individual states setting up their own bankruptcy laws that would allow somebody that had a whole bunch of debt to go to another state that has maybe really weak bankruptcy laws that allows them to write everything off. So that's basically why we do that. Post, only federal government can have an official post, so states can have their own postal system. They're private, like UPS and whatnot, that's fine. But you can't have an official government post except for at the federal level. And that's primarily, again, an efficiency thing. It's not efficient to have individual states. Only the federal government can impose a law that regulates and protects patents. A patent is protection for an invention, a design, a formula, what we call intellectual property. And the idea there is that needs to have the same law throughout the United States, because you don't want individual states having higher or lower levels of protection. because that would create a conflict between the states. Number 7, regulation of interstate commerce. Interstate, crossing state lines. That's what interstate means, 2 different states. So this has 2 different parts to it, which gets a little technical. All I want you guys to know is if a law regulates, or that is controls how goods move from one state to the next, that's federal. And vice versa, a state itself cannot impose a law that limits transfers of goods from one state to the next. Creates barriers of movement of goods between states. That would violate federal law. So an example of that might be something like, okay, here's an example. Railroad tracks, right? Box cars, Burlington Northern Santa Fe. So railroad tracks, standard railroad tracks, just a little bit like about 5.5 feet wide. So let's say Oregon decided we're going to, for environmental purposes, we're going to require all railroad tracks to go down to 3.5 feet. That way you don't use as much wood for the railroad ties, you don't use as much gravel for the ballast. So now every other state has railroad tracks that are this wide, in Oregon they're only that wide. So we're taking a train from California to Washington State through Oregon. In California, we're on tracks this wide, we get to the Oregon border, everybody has to get out of the train car and go over to the Oregon-only train cars that are narrower. And then you get to the Washington border, you got to get out and go into the back to the normal train car, right? Not very efficient. Movement of goods, same problem. You got box cars. So that law in Oregon would basically violate interstate commerce rules because it creates a barrier. It actually happened in Australia back in the day, a long time ago. They had different railroad sizes, so you go from one part to the next, you got to switch box cars. Or they had wheels that would move in and out, but they fell apart, so not a good thing. Number 8, only the federal government can borrow money on federal credit. Pretty obvious. And number 9, finally, only the federal government has the authority to declare war against a foreign nation or foreign entity, have armies, Navy, Air Force, Marines, etc. And you have National Guard, which is at a state level, but it's ultimately overseen by the federal government. Right? All right, now for you guys, possible fill-in-the-blank question. What are 4 areas where only the federal government has authority? Or 4 exclusive federal powers? So anything on this page, fair game. Okay, pretty straightforward. Next page over, I've already talked about this page a little bit, but just to come back to it, because I didn't make it all the way through. Page 44. So again, going back to the beginning of the term, we talked about 3 different branches of government: the legislative, the executive, and the judicial. That's what I have up here. E is executive, legislative, J is judicial. So having these 3 branches of government, as we've already talked about, is the idea of separation of powers. And along with that is the concept of checks and balances. Talked about that a little bit already. So first of all, just to remind you, when I say check, what I mean is a limit on governmental power. A check is a limit on governmental authority. Now, what we haven't talked about is this idea that there are different kinds of checks, but all of them are a limit. One kind of check is dependent upon a specific office, like being the president, or a specific branch of government, like the legislative branch or the Senate. We call that a dependent check. Their type of check is what we call an independent check down here. We haven't talked about those yet. And basically, an independent check is some part of the Constitution or a civil right that you have, like freedom of speech, that is reserved and protected by the Constitution, that operates as a limit on governmental power. And we call them independent because they are independent of a specific office, like being the president, and they apply to all the branches. And they can be applied by an individual person, like all of us. So dependent checks and independent. So starting with number one, this is a dependent check. You have to be the president to exercise this authority, and that's the veto power. The veto power is the power to say no to a proposed law from Congress or an amendment to a law. So that would be a check, assuming the president says no and vetoes the proposed law. That would be a check from the executive on the legislative branch. That's why I put E against L. E versus L. It's a check. Now, a balance is when the Constitution requires two parts of government or more to work together to get something done in a cooperative manner. So, passing new law. Congress must, Senate and the House of Representatives must agree on a bill jointly, together, and then they send it to the president. If the president agrees with it, signs it into law, it becomes law. The president says no, it's a veto. So depending on which way it goes, it could be a check or a balance. All right. If the president vetoes, says no, then Congress can override the veto by a supermajority vote. So they can override the veto. So that's like a check on the check, or a double check. Discount double check. So legislative against the executive. All right, impeachment. Impeachment is the power of the legislative branch to remove from office a member of the executive, including the president or cabinet members, or to remove a judge, a member of the judicial branch. We actually had a federal judge removed a few years back, impeached, because the judge was basically taking bribes. So that's a check by the legislative against the executive or the judicial, depending on how it's used. Number 4, treaties. Talked about this already, but just to remind you, a treaty is a federal law. The president has the authority to enter into a treaty. A treaty is an international agreement with other countries or organizations like the United Nations. The president, once the president has entered into a treaty, then it goes back to the Senate, and the Senate has to approve the treaty. So that's a check and a balance, depending on how it's used. So it's a legislative check or balance against the executive. All right. Number 5 we haven't talked about yet. Well, we kind of have, but not in this way. Again, we're talking about checks and balances. So now a check, known as the power of judicial review. In other words, the power of a judge in a criminal or a civil case to review the actions of the legislative, executive, and judicial branch, depending on the case, to make certain that what happened was legal. So for example, a judge can review a law passed by the legislative branch to make sure that law, first of all, is constitutional, doesn't violate the Constitution, or is not preempted by a higher level law. And if a judge decides that a lower level law violates the Constitution, it's void. Or if a lower level law, like an administrative rule, violates a statute, it's preempted by the statute. The statute wins. That's our poker game we talked about. Preemption. So that would be a check on the legislative branch, right? Now I want you to think about that. It's huge. One judge could literally overturn an act of Congress, or millions of voters that voted in a ballot measure, right? That's a huge amount of authority. Now that's subject to review, again, by a higher level court, an appellate court. So we also have judges reviewing judges. That's an appeal. So it's a check on the judicial against the judicial as well. Judicial versus executive. So a judge can review a member of the executive department, so like a police officer. Maybe a police officer searched somebody's storage unit without a search warrant. In order for a police officer to do that, there must, it's called exigent circumstance, And a judge can review whether that was a valid search and seizure. And if not, the judge can say, no, I didn't comply with the Fourth Amendment, throw it out. So it's a check from the judicial on the executive. That makes sense? So it's basically a judge having the power to overturn any of the branches of government, all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court, which has the ultimate check, basically. Now, I'll just tell you kind of an aside, won't test you on this, but constitutional law wasn't always clear at the beginning of the United States if the court actually had that power, even the Supreme Court. And so there's a famous case, Marbury versus Madison, where the U.S. Supreme Court said, yes, we do have the power to overturn as a matter of judicial review in that area. If you're going to take constitutional law, you'll learn all about that. I won't test you on that case, don't worry. All right, number 6. Now we're going to talk about independent checks. These others are dependent, meaning you have to hold that office to have that power. Independent means they can be applied by one branch against another or by individuals, like all of us, independently. So these are basically your constitutional rights, in a nutshell, that are a form of a limit on governmental power. So like, for example, the First Amendment right to free speech. Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. That's a limit on the power of Congress. So if they pass a law that limits your free speech rights, you can raise that yourself. You can file a lawsuit to have that declared unconstitutional, or through other mechanisms. So that's a limit on governmental power. So it acts as a check on governmental power. The whole First Amendment, free speech, freedom of the press, freedom of religion, the right to peaceably assemble, the right to petition for redress, those are all in the First Amendment. Those are all checks. Due process. Due process is the right, if your life, liberty, or property is going to be taken from you, you have a right to a hearing, which may include a jury trial, or an administrative hearing, or some kind of hearing, to fight what's going on. In other words, you have the right to fight. Okay, isn't that a Quiet Riot song? Quiet Riot? Yeah. You guys know what Quiet Riot is.
Is the heat on?
It's on. I don't know how to turn it off. Okay. Equal protection, 14th Amendment, 5th Amendment. Equal protection is basically, under the Constitution, all people must be treated equally under the law. This is where we get anti-discrimination rules. And the state law basically treats people unequally, violates 14th Amendment. That's a check. And you get the rest of it, right? So that's the basic idea that constitutional rights serve as a limit on governmental power. Now, for you guys, I just want you to know that basic concept, right? You don't have to, I'm not going to test you on, okay, what amendment is your right to confront witnesses come out? Don't worry about that. Okay, I won't test you on any of that. I just want you to have this basic idea that check is a limit on power, a balance is a sharing of power. And be able to list 4 out of these. Number 7, finally, and there are more than these 7, pretty much the whole Constitution itself is sort of a check. But basically the idea, number 7, I included it because it's such a cool term, right? It's so much fun to say, ex post facto. You say that, ex post facto. Yeah, that sounds cool, ex post facto, right? Slip saying. What does that mean? Do we know?
What?
What does ex post facto mean? Any guesses? Anyone? Anyone? Bueller? No?
A right to appeal?
Say it again?
Right to appeal?
It could lead to that.
Like that, the extra shit? I mean, the,
Show facts.
the,
I'll give you a hint. It has to do with this. The watch.
statute of limitations?
Statute of limitations, sort of. Going backwards in time. After the fact. After the fact. So this is a provision in the U.S. Constitution. We also see it in state constitutions that says that you can't pass a law today that goes backwards in time and makes something you did that was legal then illegal now, and then prosecute you for it. So for example, let's say,
What about weed?
That's the other way around.
Okay.
So like, let's say you got convicted for it when it was illegal, then they changed the law and made it legal. Now, do they have to go back and overturn your conviction? They don't have to, but a lot of times they will. Yeah. So, but yeah, that's a great example. So let's say, for example, I have a blue pen, and I bought the blue pen a year ago. It was legal to buy this blue pen. So they changed the law, and they say it's now illegal to have a blue pen. And they see a picture of me on Facebook or whatever, holding this blue pen a year ago. So they charge me today of having a blue pen.
Not fair.
That was a year ago, right? Yeah, it's not fair, exactly. That's ex post facto. They're going back in time, something that was legal then, and charging me with it now. Can't do that. Now, if I still have a blue pen, and they make it illegal, and I don't get rid of it, that's a different story. Question?
What if you did something that's illegal in another or not? It's illegal in the United States, but you did it outside the United States. Does that fall?
Okay.
Under does that fall under that? Or
So long story short on that, first of all, you'd have to show that there was some connection to the United States for the U.S. to even prosecute you. And part two, it's called long-arm jurisdiction. So I'll give you an example.
Hey, you can't.
The Federal Corrupt Practices Act, FCPA, is a law that makes it illegal to bribe a foreign official in a business transaction. So I go to Costa Rica, and I'm trying to open a hotel, and I bribe the local building inspector so I can get my building permit, right? Well, that happened in Costa Rica, not United States. The federal law, because I'm a U.S. either a legal resident, citizen, or company, there's jurisdiction in the United States because I am part of the U.S. It's called long arm. This is different. This basically, you've heard the term grandfather clause?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's kind of what this is. In other words, going back in time and making something illegal. Question about?
Yeah, so like when they changed tobacco from 18 to 21.
Man.
Okay, so, yeah, so how that would apply is, once they change the age, if you continue to possess it from that day forward, they could prosecute you. But again, if there's a picture of you using tobacco back when it was legal, and they tried to go back and prosecute you for it then, no, that would be ex post facto. And then the other part of this is, yeah, the possession thing, that's where there are cases that do talk about, okay, if you bought it when it was legal, do you still have it?
Yeah.
Isn't that kind of ex post facto too? Theoretically, yeah. So this also applies when they raise the punishment and go back in time. So if, let's say the punishment for owning a blue pen a year ago, yeah, it was illegal, but it was a $2 fine. Now they make it 30 days in jail. So I get charged for what I did a year ago and get 30 days in jail. But back then it was only $2. They can't do that. Can't raise the penalty for something in the past. That's not real common. It does happen. Okay, for you guys, list 4 types of checks and balances as a fill-in-the-blank question. So anything on this page is fine. And then I kind of want you to know the ones I have up here, which branch has that power. Primarily the veto power. All right. We're now going to switch gears again.